I found a letter to the editor in the New York Times, an old letter. I think it was 1991. And it said something to the effect of there's a story in Florida. There was a rainbow coalition where African Americans and Native Americans fought together and held off the US Army for 40 years. And if we didn't have such a Eurocentric view, we would know the story. Um, and that was interesting enough to kind of put me on the hunt a little bit. I read another article which discussed how stories of Native Americans are always told through a lens of suffering, that there was something wrong with that lens. There was something perverse in emphasizing suffering as if it's a tribute, that there were stories being missed because that was the focal lens. Those two things together kind of put me on the hunt to try to look deeper into the literature. Okay, what's been written about it? And there's a writer named Kenneth Porter who the literature is contested and the literature is split. So there's some Southern historians who kind of write the Black Seminoles out of the story almost. Not all. There are great Southern historians in Florida. There's just a particular group of them that do that, have done that, I should say. And then there's kind of another strain, scholars of African American history or writers on the left. And that strain originates with this scholar, a scholar named Kenneth Porter. And I started to read what he had written on the story, and it captivated me. I think it was really just the storyteller in me that was captivated by this idea of. I opened the book with this folk tale that was recorded by Zora Neale Hurston, Uncle Monday, and in brief, it's an African medicine man of the Crocodile Clan. He's stolen from his home and enslaved. He escapes from slavery, comes down to Florida in the 1830s when Osceola is there. He and others like him join up with the Seminoles. And in the folk tale, he transforms into an alligator. The Seminoles had an alligator clan, so it's preserving African traditions. They call this, the scholar Anthony Dixon has called this Black Seminole ethnogenesis or African Seminole ethnogenesis, ethno-ethnic genesis, the birth of uh, this melding of African traditions and indigenous traditions, and as a act of preservation, as an act of survival, as an act of reinvention. Um, and it's correct to call that a magical act. That's what it is. So that I think that was really the story that captivated me. And then I wanted to see, okay, where does Osceola fit into this? And what does the picture of Florida look like at that time? What does America look like at that time? My second book was in this genre, historical narrative nonfiction, but it's about World War II. And I really fell in love with the archival process. I was doing original archival research. I moved to DC for that book. And it's sort of like you're treasure hunting. You're in these old libraries, and they bring out the old documents. You can touch them, you can feel them, and you know, if you do enough of it and you're diligent and you kind of do your detective work, you find things that other people haven't found before, which is exciting, and you get to envelop yourself in another time. This phrase, "the past is a foreign country." It's a journey to the past of a foreign place, and you get to explore it and learn about it. And so that's the fun thing for me. I was excited. Okay, here's another period in history. It's going to be completely different. It's going to be a totally different archival base. And wow, this looks like an incredible story. The heart of the book takes place between 1835 and really 1839, and there's some things on the sides. But to back up and kind of give you the bigger picture, at that time, everything up to the Mississippi River, except for Michigan, maybe parts of Minnesota and Florida, are states. So Michigan and Florida are territories. Florida becomes a U.S. territory in 1821 and doesn't become a state until 1845. So this story takes place pre-statehood. Prior to that, first it's Spanish in the 1500s, then it's British for 20 years, then it's Spanish again, and then it becomes ours. And essentially, the story is, we're removing native families from their homes. This happens from the very beginning, but it becomes systematized in 1830 when Andrew Jackson signs something called the Indian Removal Act, in which we're going to systematize and nationalize this system by which settlers encroach, and there's armed conflict and threats, and there's coercive, corrupt treaties. And he mandates that by 1835, all native tribes and families be removed from the peninsula. So the story is really the Seminole tribes, and there are other tribes there that Americans at the time, in newspapers, it's printed as they're all Seminoles. They're not, but it's fine as an umbrella term. And they're Black Seminole allies, they're African Seminole allies, and their story of resistance as the army tried to remove them from the land, and as periodically citizens with the backing of the government tried to enslave the Black Seminoles. The most well-known figure, you said it correctly, is Osceola. It's originally like Osceola, which means black drink, a speaker or orator, which was something they would drink before they went into battle. And you would be called Yahola if you gave talks, if you spoke to the people, or Yaholi. So he's the most well-known. In fact, he's the icon of the Florida Seminoles football team. That's his profile. And he's one of the most famous Native Americans in American history and in our telling of things. So he was sort of an obvious choice of a figure, because quite a bit has been written about him, and he was the focus at the time. He was a Creek warrior of the Red Sticks in what became Alabama and Georgia. And that's the upper Creeks, and the lower Creeks were the White Sticks, and they allied with Andrew Jackson, and there was a war in 1813, 1814. And after that war, he comes down. He's probably 10 years old with his mother, widows and children. The Battle of Horseshoe Bend, there's 800 Red Sticks are killed. There's very few survivors. And he comes down into Florida and becomes a man, and this general who murdered his people becomes president and sends an Indian agent down to Florida, and he has to sit in the meetings while the guy reads the letters from Andrew Jackson. I'm your friend, leave, more or less. So the more I learned about Osceola, the more it became clear, and I didn't really know this at the beginning, the degree to which his story is wrapped up in mythology. I don't know if you know this movie, Unforgiven's old Western with Clint Eastwood. There's a character in that movie, great movie. There's a character in that movie who is kind of the wormy writer character. And he's going around following the gunfighters, trying to mythologize the great gunfights. So who did you shoot first? And Clint Eastwood is telling him, like, killing is not cool. It's not like that. So the West isn't really like that. It's not this romanticized version. A lot of the writing about Osceola is sort of in that vein. And to the point where it becomes difficult to separate myth. He almost exists equally as a true historical figure and as a figment of the American colonial imagination. In some ways, he's like an accidental celebrity of the colonial imagination. He's useful in the newspapers because he's a warrior and he's righteously angry and he commits violent acts. And so that's useful if you don't want to tell the real story of what you're doing, which is removing families. It's a war. Oh, it's a war, and here's the warrior, and he's the face of the war. He sort of filled that role in addition to having an interesting story. So I frame him in his own story and also in the way he is used, and not just by our side, by the way. He's sort of used by the chief, in my opinion, used by this Chief Abiaka, or Sam Jones, who's really the one who outwitted and outlasted the government. He's very careful. Abiaka is very careful to hide his power, and he makes sort of the most visible and most vocal young warrior his front man, which doesn't seem to me to be a coincidence. I wanted to introduce Abraham a little bit. So his Indian title, by the way, is Sawanak Tuscanuke, which means Shawnee warrior. He is the Black Seminole chief. He's listed in an 1838 newspaper as the chief of the Isteluste, which in Muskogee means chief of the dark people. And there are about 500 Black Seminoles in Florida. at the time, and he has about 80 warriors under his command. Um, there's a list I found in terms of talking about alliances, and it becomes very important to distinguish between the various groups because the alliance holds until it doesn't, and it splinters, and you really have to know who is who and kind of follow the shape of the alliance. And there's a real split between the Seminoles and the Mikazukis at the siege of Fort Izard in late February and March of 1836. But there's a list of the bands, which is the military units, and there was probably about 1,500 to 2,000 warriors. And so it's the Seminoles, it's the Mikazukis, it's the Creeks, it's Tallahassees, and then there's Uchis and Tallahassees. But the really two to keep in your mind are the Seminoles and the Mikazuki tribe. And the Seminoles are run by Chief Micanopy. Abraham is a top advisor to Chief Micanopy, known as the Sense Keeper or the Sense Bearer, which is sort of like a prime minister or a privy councilor, keeper of the king's conscience, and also the principal translator of the nation. And there's another Indian chief named Seminole chief named Jumper, who's sort of Micanopy, Jumper, and Abraham. And then the Mikazuki chief is Sam Jones, is Abiaka, who I mentioned. And really, from the beginning, Micanopy, Abraham, Jumper, the Seminole leadership did not want to leave and really fought defensively more than anything. They wanted to be left alone. They didn't attack Jacksonville, they didn't attack St. Augustine, they didn't attack Pensacola. They attacked Day's forces in a dramatic battle where 105 soldiers died in late December 1835, but that was defensive. That command was marching right through the middle of the Indian reservation. The Mikazukis and Osceola, who has this trauma and is righteously angry, he wants revenge, really. So there's a point where he's asking Micanopy and Abraham, come help me fight. And they say, no, we're not going to do it. There's at the siege of Fort Izard, there's a discussion which I found, which has not been printed before, where the Mikazuki's leadership and Jumper, representing the Seminoles, discuss what are we going to do? They have a siege and they've got 1,100 soldiers who are starving. Are we going to kill them? And they hear that there's more troops coming to back them up. Do we kill them or do we let them go? And the Mikazukis wanted, and especially the younger warriors, wanted to kill them, a general butchery of the whites. And the Seminoles said, we're not going to do that. And they won that argument. And then this sort of the backup came and broke up the negotiations and kind of ruined the talks. But from that point on, you can see a split where most of the Seminoles are not fighting. Now there's smaller bands that are fighting. They join the Mikazukis. King Philip Wildcat still fights on, and the future chief of the nation, Holato Mikoche, who became Holato Miko, we know him as William Bowlegs or Billy Bowlegs. He also fought and resisted and resisted. So you can see the motivations are slightly different, and the tactics are different. The evidence base was different. For my last book, it was almost all government documents. So it was almost all Washington, D.C., and then some at what was then called the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, which is a Carnegie institution. For this one, the best sources are really soldiers' letters and diaries. They're the most candid. There are a bunch of military letters and documents, and I spent 6 weeks in D.C. at the Library of Congress and at the National Archives, and then I went up to West Point. That's another great place for archives. So you sort of have to puzzle out, all of these soldiers. There's state militia, but then there's also volunteers and there's federal soldiers. They're all dispersing back home. So all of the documents really pass to the family members who give them to state historical societies and local universities. So that became part of the puzzle. Like, okay, so they're all dispersing. Let me try the Maine Historical Society. Whoop, there's a diary that no one's cited before. So I did a bunch of that. The most kind of shocking source that I found, which I've only seen one citation for it, and not for anything relevant to this book, or not for anything that I write about, is a 1837 diary by this British-born Indian agent named John Casey. And in that book, there is like a seminal account of what actually happened at Izard that hasn't been cited. There is Abraham's will is in that document. There is a list of Black Seminole field commanders and the soldiers that fight under them. Um, there's there's just a lot of new information in that book. Um, there's some troop numbers in that book. And that was a process of, okay, who is closest to the source? And I found several references where this John Casey, he knew the Black Seminoles best. In fact, the Seminoles trusted him, and had their respect. He was honest with them. And there's one thing where Jessup says he knows them better than anybody in the army. Like, okay, let's track down him. And there all that material was. Um, so that was great. You know, Abraham's name, we finally know Abraham's correct name, Suanak Tuscanuki. That was mistranscribed as Suanafe Tuscanuki, which had no meaning. So we now know it's Shawnee Warrior. His real background, in my opinion, I'm 95% sure that he was born among the Seminoles, not a formerly enslaved bondservant in Pensacola. And this story of the Seminole and Creek split and how central that was to the Black Seminole story. That you have this shift in the Creek slave code, where they're shifting from a system where children of POWs can be full members of the tribe to a system in which, like the Anglos, like the Americans, there's transgenerational enslavement of Africans. And so the Seminoles are practicing it as late as the 1770s, the old way. So there is a part of the Black Seminole population, which I haven't seen that emphasized properly, which are children of POWs captured by the Creeks in the Revolutionary War. They fought with the British. You know, it doesn't belong to me anymore. It's not mine anymore. I had my journey with it, and then everyone gets to whatever resonates with the reader. For me, I can say really what stood out for me is Abraham's character, is his, there's sort of this stereotype there, or the imagined version of these kinds of conflicts in which there's the warrior, and it used to be the quote unquote savage warrior, and then it was the noble warrior. It's like, oh, I mean it as a compliment, but it's still kind of a wooden warlike character has no sense of humor. There's no wryness. There's no there's no political structure. Like, there's no wisdom. There's no restraint. There's no like, the only brave thing you can do is fight, and if you don't do that, you're a coward or something like that. And that's not at all the story. That's the story that Americans wanted to tell to justify what they were doing. And all of those characteristics that I described are all apparent in the Seminole leadership, and particularly Abraham was incredibly poised, with incredible diplomatic talents. There's a description of him walking into an army camp of 1,300 Southern men. It's called the Army of the South, who know that he was a participant in the Dade Battle, where 105 Army men were killed, and walks in there and with perfect dignity and composure, just and he negotiates his people's freedom. He succeeds at that. It's only in this strange American frame where, like, the only thing you can do is to be brave, the only virtue is to fight. Well, there's children here, there are women here, and they're with us. It's not like the army. We're protecting them, and they could be enslaved or they could be killed. So what is the wise move? Is are we only going to stick with this stereotype of, like, there's a romantic attachment to the land? I mean, come on, we're taking their land. This is like, we're stealing their land. Oh, they have a romantic attachment to the land. Is that it? There's a description of Sam Jones where he's talking to a physician, and the physician asks him, why won't you immigrate? And he says, I never consented to do it. There is no more use in talking any more about it. I didn't say I would do it. Like, nobody wants to leave. There's another description of where there are prisoners or forced immigrants who are waiting to go to the West in what became Oklahoma. In South Carolina, And the journalists come to see Osceola because he's become this famous figure. And there's a line in the newspaper where, like, there are all these chiefs that outrank him who were not disposed to grieve, right? So this is the opposite of, like, everybody's weeping. Of course, they're not happy, but then the newspapers, they only go for Osceola. They want his mourning. Like, that's the product. And they ignore the others. So I think that understanding how warped that usual story is, the ways in which it's warped, why it's warped that way, what's underneath that story, what are the stories that are being obscured. That's what I took from it. And a picture of early America, which I was not prepared for it to be so stark. Uh, there's a book called Rogue's Paradise about antebellum Florida, which paints how kind of lawless, and there's speculators and there's profiteers and there's corruption, and there's like an image of the West and the South. Uh, but I wasn't quite prepared for the degree of kind of bias and hate that was apparent in the primary sources, which were unpleasant to have to live with for like 2 years.